All right. Hi, back again. More personality and stress. So J.A. Gray had a reinforcement sensitivity theory. He believed in a biologically based system that includes two independent motivational processes. So very biological, again, looking at the physiology and the nervous system. He talked about a behavioral approach system, call it BAS, which is sensitive to rewards and driven by dopamine. So it's a system, it would be a system someone has, like somebody high, like have with a sensitive BAS system would be very sensitive to the rewards of a situation, like their dopamine levels are running strong, which would get them to approach positive situations, motivates us to approach situations that might bring rewards or positive experience more quickly. And then behavioral inhibition system, BIS, sensitive to punishment or lack of reward and driven more by norepinephrine, which is one of our stress response hormones, neurotransmitters, things like that. So motivates us to avoid situations that might feel threatening. So it really looks at personality. Are we more prone to approach situations looking for positive reward or to avoid situations in fear of punishment or threat? And so more recent versions, updated versions, when I talk about these theories, I'm not telling you that the research is all like absolutely 100% there. It wasn't necessarily for this. More recent and updated versions, because it's still in the literature quite a bit, have adapted to say um, to combine it with other models. So the BAS system, the approach system, a sensitivity of that is associated with positive emotions and correlate with extroversion. So people who are like high in extroversion or high in positive emotions tend to have strong approach systems. They will seek out reward. They will seek out opportunities for positive experience. Where people with like strong BIS systems, BIS because the last word is systems, so I'm basically saying anyway, are associated with negative affect meaning kind of emotionality, depression, and neuroticism. So those personality types tend to have, we would correlate with BIS sensitivity. Um, so that's it. We'll use BAS and BIS a little bit more later. So just to kind of keep in mind what it is. So the big five, also known as the five-factor model, developed. It's a self-report system. The big five is one of the most used still models of personality in psychology, in the literature. I have varying feelings about it, but it's very, very popular. Um, and psychologists talk about it a lot in terms of personality. Costa and McRae developed a self-report instrument to measure the big five called the NEOPI. So the big five are neuroticism, extroversion, openness to experience, conscientiousness, and agreeableness. Those last two were added a little bit later. They weren't in the original. That's why it's NEO/PI. So the neuroticism, extroversion, and openness were first, and then personality inventory. And then conscientiousness and agreeableness were added later, which is interesting because there's probably the most, like a lot of work on conscientiousness has come forth. So the big five factors, here they are. Extroversion, description of someone high in this, talkative, passionate, active, dominant, sociable, low score, quiet, and feeling passive. Agreeableness, good-natured, soft-hearted, and trusting. Low scores, irritable, ruthless, and suspicious. Neuroticism, worrying, emotional, vulnerable, and anxious, or calm, emotional, hardy, self-controlled, and have a sense of well-being. Highs and lows. Openness, creative, imaginative, likes variety, and is going to be really pumped for like those reward things too, though. Uncreative, down to earth, prefers routine. Conscientiousness, conscientious, hardworking, ambitious, responsible, kind of really cares about doing well and mastery of something. You can think about conscientious students or not. Negligent, lazy, aimless, irresponsible. So these are the two this is the spectrum of these five. So now we're going to be talking about all of these or some of these as we go through. So what are stress-prone personality factors? We've talked about some of the different traits, the different models, how they define them. So let's look at which ones would be stress-prone. think is kind of obvious. I'll look at it a little bit more. I keep moving, sorry. So neuroticism, let's discuss it a little farther. Once thought that psychological conflicts such as neuroses could cause physical ailments, but there is no supportive evidence. So there's no real research backing the idea that those high in neuroticism or with neuroses, as they're called, um, have are that causes them to have physical ailments. Now, if it causes you more stress, we know what that can do to the immune system, which can then, if neurotic traits cause greater stress in situations, then that can of course impede our immune system and make us more sick. I mean, that makes sense to me. But neuroticism described with terms such as anxious, tense, low self-esteem, depressed, etc. We talked about that. People high in N report more frequent and intense negative emotion in their everyday lives. Just kind of see threats, are anxious and worried, and kind of live with this disposition, as it were. Of all personality factors, neuroticism seems to carry the highest risk to health and well-being. Predicts shorter, less happy, less healthy, and less successful lives to a meaningful extent. That was one kind of looking at all the different things. So it kind of goes against what the first one says, doesn't it? And that might be been more about mortality as I think about it. That it doesn't mean you have but I don't know. I think it's been mixed reviews, but there have been reviews of the research that has shown that it's a stressful way to live, to be worried and anxious and depressed a lot of the time, right? I think that makes sense, and that stress causes us further problems. So neuroticism. So here are some five. So people that discuss neuroticism, there might be what we call the neurotic cascade. 5 processes that reinforce one another that happens within the neurotic constellation of being, making stress more challenging. So there's a hyperreactivity, more likely to react to stressors with more negative affect because it is biologically predisposed, highly reactive limbic system, sensitive BIS, so responsive to punishment. All these things may make the neurotic personality hyperreactive. And then differential exposure. People high in this often set up scenarios that lead them to experience more hassles or negative life events. They seem to just be in positions within relationships that bring this hyperreactivity and this sort of neurotic disposition to the table, and then set up the relations in order to that cause more stress. Differential appraisal. They're more likely to appraise situations negatively. When they're non-threatening, there should be a period after that. Low self-efficacy when it comes to managing consequences. So a couple things here. They look at a situation, maybe they're having, somebody does something, somebody forgets to call them or text, and they appraise that situation from this like negative affect, like assuming the worst. And that's also the exposure, like they've put themselves in a position to constantly kind of see things in this negative way. And then it causes them more stress. And they have low self-efficacy means that they don't believe they have the tools to manage the consequences of that negativity and that hyperreactive stress. There's a lack of confidence in their ability to cope. And so then it becomes a victim mentality almost. This always happens to me. These things are always happening to me. And then we kind of set ourselves up to see those things happening to us more and more when we do that. And then mood spillover. It can lead to, so then this person didn't call me or text me. It's because they're a bad friend or they don't like me. And then this is always happening to me. And then it spills over to ruminating on this, which leads to more negative emotion that goes on beyond what's happened. And then the sting of familiar problems. That's the kind of flawed solutions to problems are often repeated. So they see it, so it's kind of doing the same thing over and over again, even though you're getting a negative response. I see it this way, and then I call them up and I say unkind things, or I send them a nasty text or a nasty gram, and and then it just kind of repeats itself. It's this self-fulfilling prophecy, this fly trapped in a window. It's like if a fly gets trapped between two panes of glass, they just keep hitting themselves against the glass. It's kind of repeated patterns that validate a sense of helplessness in a situation. Um, and so these is what it's saying is this cascade. All of these things can happen that just keep circling around each other with the negative affect and um, kind of validating the neuroticism that then continues and creates sort of an unhappy cascade of events for this personality. So more people high in neuroticism are more likely to use avoidant coping mechanisms. So in coping mechanisms, we have those that are avoidant, like we disengage from things, and we have engaging coping mechanisms where we face things. So neurotics will tend to disengage or avoid, withdraw, just kind of have wishful thinking rather than doing anything about it. Denial, use escape mechanisms like alcohol and drugs. There is a high correlation, which I think feels pretty natural, with anxiety and depression. They tend to internalize, like we see a higher rate of internalizing disorders, um, which can be depression and anxiety, things that we turn inward on ourselves. Primary pattern for mental disorders: high levels of neuroticism, low conscientiousness, and low agreeableness, and low extraversion. So somebody who's really low in all of those and then high in neuroticism is kind of like the primary pattern for some of these mental disorders. Some correlation with relationship dissatisfaction, because you can put yourself, if you are constantly appraising things in a negative affect and putting self in situations with others that we're in primary relationships with, we're not going to be satisfied because we're going to see things that they do in negative lights. Evidence that neuroticism modestly increases risk of engaging in health adverse behaviors. These may include negative coping mechanisms such as drinking and drugs or smoking, more work-related accidents, not really understood why, but there seems to be a modest increase in some of those things for those high in neuroticism. So what are some stress-resistant personality factors? Because few of us are all one thing. It does happen, but we are complex creatures, and I want you to remember that we have different levels of different things and some things that can protect us. But if we go back, many of you watched the wolf video at the very beginning of the class. It's kind of like, which do we feed? Are we going to choose to feed maybe the semi-neurotic personality traits within us, or are we going to feed those that we have, maybe they're not strong enough yet, that are stress resistant? So let's look at what those could be. Conscientiousness seems to be number one. Most health advantages, it has people that score high in conscientiousness have the most health advantages of all the big five. According to research, there's a small amount of research done on this as compared to other big five factors because it was added later. So there's not as much research maybe as introversion, extroversion, that kind of stuff. People that are conscientious have less negative affect, more positive affect, less prone to clinical or personality disorders, less substance abuse, more life satisfaction, greater subjective well-being, more satisfying relationships, and greater academic achievement. So kind of being conscientious, wanting to do well and show up to things and be responsible. And I think it can also, though, tend to feel like it's a personality that kind of just, it's always wanting to do really well. And that can be stressful. But I think a deep conscientiousness is also one who finds something within things, like looks for the good. It's the optimist that's going to connect the dots in positive ways. I'm studying something. Where can I want to do well. So how can I find something positive about this? How can I engage in this in a positive way? And I think that's a deeper conscientiousness than just a surface one of, going to fight to do really well. And we can build that, I think, through building optimism and positive emotions and so forth. They're more likely to engage in healthy behaviors. This is why conscientiousness serves us well. There's the why. More likely to avoid health adverse behaviors because their life has meaning for them. They want to make something of their life, and so they want to do things that are good for them. They have a tendency to have an everyday mindfulness. Of the big five, one study analysis showed greatest correlation between everyday mindfulness and conscientiousness. They have self-discipline and self-regulation, which are also common to mindfulness. Um, so growing our mindfulness can also help in this trait. Study on HIV patients, those high in conscientiousness had slower disease progression. They seemed to increase their T cells and decrease their viral load more. Conscientiousness associated with greater medical adherence. So they also tended to do what they were supposed to do for their health, plus better coping skills and less perceived stress levels. So there was less appraisal of threat and stress, which then didn't activate their HPA system and activate their stress response system, which lowered their immune system. So, which would then cause, of course, greater disease progression if they do that. So I thought that was interesting. Extraversion, moving on to extraversion. Rates number one in positive affect and subjective well-being. People tend to say that they feel better, say that they're happier. They may have more positivity bias, see in the world things that are positive. They tend to savor good things that happen and stay positive longer. Like one of the big differences is that extroverts will simply like see something positive and then the positivity spirals. Whereas sometimes people with negative affect, they'll still feel good for a little bit, but then it'll diminish and they'll go on and have more negativity bias. Strong approach system, sensitive to rewards, inconsistent where morality is concerned. So I'm not going to go there. One study shows some positive correlation with post-traumatic growth, which means that when something bad does happen, extroverts are more willing to look at how it can help them grow. With conscientiousness, if you combine it with conscientiousness, it's associated with resilience. They're able to use Fredrickson's broaden and build, which we talked about in positive psychology. So they broaden what they see as possible, broaden their social networks, broaden when stress happens, and then become more adaptable and have more tools to build upon during struggling times. Openness to experience and agreeableness. So studies show some health protective benefits with openness, but they seem to have, so people that are open seem to have greater emotional awareness. I think some of this is that they're not as afraid of telling how they feel. Like they're really willing to step into feelings and not have kind of an avoidance of that. They have higher levels of curiosity. They're open to new experiences, to hearing about things. They kind of open their mind to growth, as it were, and to new ideas, which might lead to greater flexibility and adaptability in times of stress. Now, they're also more prone to substance use, as we saw, because they're open to experience. Agreeableness, few studies around impact on longevity. It correlates with higher relationship satisfaction, especially when there's a low neuroticism and a high extroversion and conscientiousness. But if you're willing to be kind of agreeable and compromise and work with somebody in a relationship, it's easier, right? So you're more satisfied. And if it's mostly in interpersonal areas like that, that's where most of the studies have gone. So another trait away from the big five, dispositional optimism. So we talked a little bit about this with positive psychology, but it's a trait that expects positive outcomes. Seligman, who was the guy with positive psych, said, optimists have a strength that allows them to interpret their setbacks as surmountable, particular to a single problem and resulting from temporary circumstances or other people. Pessimists are up to 8 times more likely to become depressed when bad events happen. They do worse in school, sports, and most jobs, and their talents augur than they should be based on their talents. They have worse physical health and shorter lives. They have rockier interpersonal relationships. So I think you could take a lot of stuff we've already talked about and integrate it into that. But optimists look, they connect the dots. They also see more options available in situations. So don't shut down when bad things happen. Optimists have a reduced risk of death of coronary heart disease, more willing to engage in engagement coping versus that avoidant disengaged. They deal directly with stressors and emotions and the emotions that around those stressors. And so that, kind of the truth sets us free. We can look at the emotions, we'll face things, and then it doesn't come inside and eat us up from the inside. Optimism. So another one, locus of control, just real briefly here. Actually, I'm going to pause so you can pause, and we'll do this in the last video.